Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn series. My name is Giza Lopez, and I am the Executive Director of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. On behalf of the YJI, I am happy to welcome each of you to this month's webinar. Thanks for joining us today in this virtual space and for making time during your lunch to learn more about youth justice research. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat at any point now. Let me also express my thanks to our partners in New York State, the Division of Criminal Justice Services, the Office of Children and Family Services, the University at Albany, and the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. Without their support, we wouldn't be here today. Today, we're doing things a little differently, and we bring to you a dynamic duo. It is our pleasure to host Dr. David Harding as a presenter, and also Mr. Tom O'Neill as our guest facilitator. Dr. David Harding is a professor of sociology and director of the Social Science D Lab at UC Berkeley. He studies poverty, inequality, and the criminal justice system, and he is author or co-author of 4 books, including On the Outside, Prisoner Reentry and Reintegration, and After Prison, Navigating Adulthood in the Shadow of the Justice System. Tom O'Neill is the Principal Law Clerk to Deputy Chief Administrative Judge for Justice Initiatives, Honorable Edwina Richardson-Mendelson. Additionally, Mr. O'Neill serves as the Director of the Youth and Emerging Adult Justice Division of the Office for Justice Initiatives within our New York State Unified Court System. Tom, that just rolled out of my tongue there. David and Tom, it is wonderful to have you with us today. We're very much looking forward to today's presentation and to the conversation that follows. So I'm going to be quiet, and David, the virtual floor is yours. Thanks again.
Hey, thanks so much, Dr. Lopez, for that introduction. And thanks everybody for attending. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Let me share my slides here. There we go. Okay, so today my goal is to introduce a new way of thinking about reentry and reintegration, which I'm calling a systems perspective, or we might call an institutional perspective, that focuses on the ways that the justice system itself supports or hinders the reintegration, especially of young adults coming home from prison. And in this talk, I'm going to sort of highlight 2 of the ways that our justice systems tend to hinder reintegration, which I've been calling justice traps and system harms. So as we're getting started here, maybe we'll launch the first poll and just get a sense of who's here in the audience. Okay, great. Looks like we have a great mix of practitioners, policymakers, educators, researchers, people with connections to the system, advocates, and so on. So that bodes well for our discussion here. So this is going to be kind of a research-based talk. I won't get into a lot of the details of the research, but I do want to say that what I'm presenting today is sort of based on 2 recent pieces. One is this book, After Prison, that Dr. Lopez mentioned, which is co-authored with Heather Harris, who's now at the Public Policy Institute of California. And so that's an empirical study of 1,300 young men who left prison in Michigan in 2003 and who were followed over time. And then the second piece is a recently published paper co-authored with Bruce Western of Columbia University, which talks about some of these more conceptual ideas and the idea of careers and criminalization and the justice traps and system harms. And I believe participants in the webinar will get a link afterwards to download that paper if you're interested. It's normally behind a paywall, but this link will get you through for free. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about this empirical study. And it's really motivated by the idea that the transition to adulthood, which is also sometimes called by researchers the period of emerging adulthood, which we generally think of as age 18 to 25. This is a really critical period in people's lives because it sort of sets the stage for many things that happen in the rest of their lives. So completing schooling, finding their first jobs, making long-term romantic connections, building families, or at least starting that process for many people. And we're motivated in this study by asking the question, if that transition to adulthood period is interrupted by incarceration and especially long-term imprisonment, who recovers from that and how do they do so? So we collected administrative data on 1,300 men who were paroled in Michigan in 2003. They were ages 18 to 25 when they were paroled. Followed them over time, different number of years depending on which records we're talking about linking. We were also able to examine and code up all of their parole agents' case notes, which gives us a much more nuanced window into things like housing, contact with the criminal justice system, and in some cases, family relationships. And so we're working in this life course framework, which thinks about the trajectories that people are on and the transitions they make, especially in this early transition to adulthood period. And we're able to study not just their criminal justice outcomes, things like arrest and re-imprisonment, or sanctions put on them by the criminal justice system, but also through linked records, employment, housing, death records, and even college enrollments. So briefly, what are some of the main takeaways from the book? In a word, precarity. Most young people returning home from prison really struggle to reintegrate back into the economy, into their families, communities, and so on. So more specifically, slightly over half find formal employment in the first year. They have much higher rates of job loss than similar age people in the national population with similar levels of education. They have extremely high levels of residential instability. Only about 30% actually return home to where they were living before prison, the same neighborhoods, let alone the same households. And they're one of the most residentially unstable vulnerable groups we know of, moving on average every 4 months. One bright spot is that about 3/4 of them did earn their GED, mostly in prison. And in the 7 years we were able to follow them afterwards, between 1/4 and 1/3 actually enrolled in college at some point. And that's, I think, an important finding that I'll come back to. Health is a major issue, even for this young population. We saw very high rates of overdose death and violent death. And as you may not be surprised to hear, very high rates of recidivism. So about half remained involved in the criminal justice system in the long term, either through re-imprisonment or repeated jail incarceration or other forms of short-term custody. What made the difference for those who were able to sort of beat the odds here? Family support was key. Being in supportive neighborhoods with access to jobs and having access to supportive institutions like colleges, and avoiding some of the harms of other more challenging institutions like the labor market and their contact with the criminal justice system. I would also note that there's really important racial disparities in these outcomes, and also very important racial disparities in access to these supportive contexts, and how people are treated by institutions as well. So if we think about how to better support young people who are returning home from prison, I would argue that one way to think about or to sort of map our conventional approaches to recidivism prevention are the following two categories, that we tend to think about our interventions as one of these two things. So either acting to change individual decision-making, so CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is a great example of that, or trying to encourage them or restrict them to avoid what criminologists call criminogenic environments. So for example, putting residential restrictions, contact restrictions, curfews, and things like that. So I'm going to sort of push us to think a little bit more institutionally about this and about the justice systems themselves. And to motivate that a little bit, I wanted to show you a little bit of data. This is now national data, not from our research, and the citations there at the bottom of the slide. The graph here, there'll be another graph appearing in a moment, is what criminologists call the age crime curve. So this shows the sort of frequency or percentage of, or actually, it's per 100,000 crime rate by age in the United States. And these data are from 2002. And so you can see that offending peaks around the age of 18 in the United States. If we were to look at violent offending, the peak might be a little bit later. But this sort of curve is kind of an iron law of criminology that we keep seeing again and again, and hasn't changed dramatically over time. I want to contrast this now with the age structure or the age composition of the prison population. So this graph is a little bit more complicated, so bear with me for a moment. Each of these lines here, focus on the lines less so than the dots, is the age, represents the age composition of the state prison population in the US at different points in time. So the lowest line is the oldest one, that's from 1974. The solid line is the most recent one in these data, which is from 2004. So around the time of our data. And you can see that the age composition has been changing, is beginning older and older. More and more of the area under the curve is in later ages. But even in the earliest time period, we see a big disjuncture between the age of offending and the age of people in our prison system. Now, some of that is, of course, due to long-term incarceration for offenses that happen early in life. But it still raises the question of why do we see such long-term participation in the criminal justice system, even way after what criminologists consider the peak age of offending. So this is where our kind of systems or institutional perspective on reentry and reintegration comes in. So we're trying to think about the ways in which criminal justice organizations and agencies are kind of key actors in understanding these processes. So in other words, when someone receives a sanction from the criminal justice system, that sanction is both a product of that individual's behavior, but also the decisions that the state or the government makes. So we rely on this concept called criminalization, which is the process by which people are classified as criminal and become subject to the control of criminal justice agencies. This sort of puts the focus back on criminal justice agencies. And in the paper I mentioned earlier, we introduced this idea of careers in criminalization. So these sustain criminal justice involvement through repeated incarceration and ongoing police and court contact. And so again, thinking about that age composition of the prison system. And so these processes are racialized, they're classed in that racial minorities, especially African Americans and people from lower class backgrounds are much more subject to these processes. And we can think of them as some of the ways in which race and poverty are translated into criminalization and create what we're calling system-induced harms, and criminal justice traps. So system-induced harms we define as physical, psychological, and reputational injuries that may be criminogenic or otherwise impede reintegration. And criminal justice traps are cycles of involvement created through intensive surveillance, compliance enforcement, and system marking. And we developed these ideas based on a systematic review of recent research on the criminal justice system and its intersections with race and class. And so there's a lot of research and a lot of examples behind all of these, not all of which we can cover in detail today, but it's worth giving you just some examples of what we mean here. So these are just a few of the studies that that are covered in that paper. So we know, for example, that pretrial detention increases the risk of conviction, right? So this is a type of system trap. Criminal record stigma restricts employment, so this is a form of system harm. We know that police contact, especially among young people, adversely affects mental health and confidence in our other social institutions, including schools and health systems. Prior convictions increase the harshness of future sentencing. And the last example is that misdemeanor prosecution can lead to greater likelihood of future criminal complaints, right? So we see this sort of in these examples. Through system harms, people are harmed by their contact with the criminal justice system, which leaves them more susceptible to criminal behavior and therefore further involvement in the system. And through justice traps, we see the ways in which the system itself, by monitoring, surveilling, and marking people, sort of keeps them involved in the system. Okay, maybe we'll pause here and put up the second poll, which is about whether folks in the audience have ever observed in their work or experienced themselves justice traps or system harms. Okay, looks like the poll has mostly settled. A little over 70% say they've observed or experienced justice traps. And we see a high frequency of system harms observed or experienced as well. Okay, really interesting, really interested in hearing more about this during the discussion and the Q&A. So the examples I gave were not specific to, on the prior slide, to reentry or reintegration after prison. So let me do a little bit of a deeper dive into that, since that's our focus for today. So in the literature, one place in the research literature, one place this comes up is the dual role of probation and parole agents. That people who study them as workers and as law enforcement agents find that they're in this sort of dual role of both law enforcement and social work. And that's not just that tension between those two is not just a major source of burnout, but also one that especially recently often ends up getting resolved on the side of law enforcement rather than social work. So in the context of reentry, the front line of this is of course those who are working with clients who are reentering. And this is part of a larger phenomenon that my colleague here at the Berkeley Law School, Jonathan Simon, has called managerial parole. So he's done a sort of historical analysis about how parole itself has changed over time, along with the rise of mass incarceration, to one where there's a sort of social work, what I would call social work orientation, to one that focuses on risk assessment, caseload management, preventing offending rather than rehabilitation or reintegration, and focuses its sort of metrics and goals on violations and revocations, and preventing future offending rather than reintegration. And I think that's in part a process or a product of the sheer scale of the system, right? That as more people have been imprisoned, and more people are coming out of prison, the task of parole and probation agencies has become much more difficult. They've had to manage many more clients, and so have shifted to this managerial parole. One of the main mechanisms through which the system harms can occur here are through the need to comply with parole or other community supervision requirements. And there's quite a bit of research now showing the ways that sort of compliance can interfere with key aspects of reintegration, can interrupt housing, separate people from social supports, make maintaining employment more difficult, and also just create a lot of stress and mental strain for people who are on supervision. And finally, on the flip side of kind of surveillance and control, we know now that more intensive supervision leads to a greater risk of violations. And this is sort of seen across many different studies. One kind of cautionary tale is the rise of what was called intensive probation. And the idea originally was for judges to have an option for what were considered sort of medium risk offenders other than imprisonment. And so rather than putting them on regular probation, many states created intensive probation or intensive supervision. The end result of that, however, was that once that tool became available, many lower risk people were then put on more intensive levels of supervision than they would have had before. Criminologists call this phenomenon net widening, resulting in more violations and more reimprisonment. And today, this is not entirely a result of intensive probation, of course. About 30% of prison admissions are for violations. So what are some of the implications of this sort of systems way of thinking? I'm not going to claim that this is comprehensive, but these are some ideas I would put out there for discussion. So most broadly, it gets us thinking about fixing our systems rather than fixing individuals. I don't want to argue that the approaches I outlined as sort of the conventional or standard approaches now should be abandoned, but that we should think about the way our justice systems work in addition to helping individuals. One, I think, important thing is to create what I would call off-ramps from supervision. So making it clear what someone on supervision can do to lessen the length of and intensity of their supervision, and supporting them in doing so. Currently, we have a system in which supervision tends to keep them engaged in the criminal justice system in various ways, creating clear pathways that someone who's on supervision can understand and has the resources to follow will help people move away from those traps. We also have a situation in many states and localities where people with criminal records are not eligible for the programs that they would need and could take advantage of to improve their reintegration. So I think that's another easy thing we can do. And also we can increase their supports to reduce their risks. So, instead of thinking of behavior that is counter-normative among someone on supervision as being indicating that they need more punishment, we think of it as indicating that we aren't providing them currently with the supports that they need. I wouldn't argue that we should sort of never reincarcerate people, but thinking about supports as an alternative to reincarceration. And then more locally for practitioners, I would say, we need to take a really close look at when revocations are issued, under what circumstances, and whether there are alternatives to doing so. And one important way that can be done is to work in partnership with local agencies, whether nonprofit organizations that provide services, employers, youth advocates, youth themselves, to develop alternative responses when people are starting to struggle on parole or probation. I think there's also a role for social service agencies to help people navigate community supervision. That was one of the things in both of our books that we saw many examples of people making kind of ill-informed choices about how they should be working with their parole or probation officer that often led them into more trouble than they needed to be in. So helping people to sort of navigate that experience and reduce the harms from it. Increasing access to supportive institutions. I mentioned college quite a bit earlier. This was probably the thing that most surprised us about this study, the large number of people who enrolled in college. And that was one of the more supportive institutions that they engaged in after their release. They were, of course, receiving a lot of help from family, but in terms of the institutional perspective. So I think there's a big role for especially community colleges to play in helping with job training or even associates and bachelor's degree, which many people coming out of prison are interested in doing. And then I think it's also worth taking a very close look locally at the ways in which parole and probation agents are incentivized and constrained in their work. So an example of that is as we were doing our research in Michigan, we were often told, we spoke to some of the agents as we were trying to interpret the parole agent case notes, and we would be told things like, as soon as someone started struggling, the agent sort of felt themselves in their job at risk, because if they committed any sort of crime, the agent themselves would be held accountable, and that would reflect on their work performance. And so they were often very quick to put out warrants for people's arrest at the point, and at that point, they were no longer responsible. So I think that's just one anecdote, but it speaks to sort of a larger issue of sort of reorienting the work of parole and probation agents toward probably the work that they were more motivated to do when they first got interested in the job, which is supporting people's reintegration. Currently, they're typically held accountable for bad behavior, but not really rewarded when their clients enroll in college or complete job training or things like that. Those sort of metrics are not particularly tracked or emphasized in the day-to-day work, which is very focused on supervision and control. So thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop there. And this is how to reach me on social media or email if you want to continue the conversation afterwards. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides and turn it over to Tom.
Thank you, Dr. Harding, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to give you a little moment to process and digest all that while I reintroduce myself for anyone who may be joining later. So my name is Tom O'Neill. I am the law clerk to Deputy Chief Administrative Judge for Justice Initiatives Edwina, Richardson-Mendelson. I also serve as the Director of Youth and Emerging Adult Justice for the Office for Justice Initiatives for the New York State Unified Court System. So there's my full title. It's a lot of words. Thank you for bearing with me through that. So my role at this point now is, as Dr. Harding mentioned, I'm just going to be here to facilitate. We've gotten some great questions from you all so far. So now we're going to engage with Dr. Harding in a little Q&A, a little discussion, and it'll be my role to help bring those questions to Dr. Harding. And hopefully we'll have a great discussion based off that. Our wonderful YGI team is doing a great job of capturing all your questions that you've been asking so far. So please continue to ask those. If we don't get to any questions, blame me. I will do the best that I can to cover what is on everybody's minds for the time that we have remaining. So with all that said, that'll be our game plan for the next 20 or 25 minutes or so. With that said, I'm actually going to start off with a statement rather than a question, and that statement is going to be just to thank Dr. Harding for your excellent insight, the information that you have provided us so far. I think that this is a really worthwhile discussion to have. I'm glad that you're here to talk with us about this. I think that often when we gather in these spaces and we talk about young adults, I'm used to calling them emerging adults. I'll sort of use the terms interchangeably. We talk about how they meet certain critical life events. And so these are things like employment or residential stability or education or forming family connections. And so as these young adults, they meet these certain developmental milestones, we start to see trajectories forms. And as you noted with the Michigan study, we can measure these trajectories. And you know, in an ideal world, ideally, when we're talking about these are trajectories towards being a fully mature adult who has minimal criminal justice contact moving forward. But I think that's really crucial for those of us who are in the justice system and in public institutions to talk about how these trajectories maybe can be altered or can even be burdened by criminal justice contact, you know, and as you mentioned, not something that is just an isolated incident, but something that maybe is sustained and repeated and can be recurring moving forward. So one thing that I think is crucial to note is that when we're talking about these trajectories and the way that maybe they change, that even among young adults or emerging adults who have this unifying experience of incarceration and release and then reentry, their trajectories might differ in a lot of ways. And there are external factors that are going to impact those trajectories, and they're going to impact, you know, the course of their life. And some of those external factors, it might be race or gender or even geography. So based on those, I'll narrow it down for you at the outset. And I'll ask specifically on race. One of the things that your research has shown is that the transition to adulthood is something that it's racialized, it's impacted by race, and it would follow that reentry is as well. So do you have any thoughts about how our systems are sort of impacted by race in reentry, and how we can respond to that and address the challenges that are brought up by those differences?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, our justice systems are, of course, you know, there's a long line of research showing the way that they are racialized, and race enters into a lot of the decisions we make. And so I think it's incumbent upon local practitioners to be mindful of that and in their practices. But you know, these justice systems are also embedded in an incredibly racialized society on, you know, so many different dimensions we could talk about. Just to make things you know, concrete, one of the ways we see this in reentry is that the young men in our study who are Black or African American, you know, they're returning to communities that have fewer resources, where there's fewer jobs available. That's the result of longstanding residential segregation. They're returning to families that have fewer resources to support them, and the family support is absolutely essential in the reentry literature. Due to, you know, long histories of and ongoing discrimination, but we all, you know, we see it creep up in lots of other ways. A really interesting example we found in the research in Michigan was that we noticed that the kind of addiction profiles of Black and white people in our study were quite different. So actually, whites had more mental health problems, more serious addictions. But when we looked at the way the criminal justice system was addressing addiction, we saw that the young Black men were much more likely to be tested and sanctioned for addiction related issues. Some of that is the geography in different counties in different parts of Michigan, you know, working differently. But it sort of, you know, really drove home the importance of thinking carefully about race.
I just want to follow up on that, Dr. Harding. You just mentioned geography, which I think is a really interesting lens about looking at all this. One thing that I'll share, we have a saying, I'll localize this to New York. I know that not everybody in the audience is New York based, so appreciate you letting me be a little selfish, and I'll localize this to New York. But we're a big state. We have a lot of different varieties of communities. And so one saying that I've heard among the courthouses is that if you've been to one county in New York, you've been to one county, which is kind of corny, but it's true. There's a lot of experiences that are not always replicated just by the unity of the state. And so a young adult who is in Franklin County might have a much different experience than somebody who's in the Bronx. But even with that, that's a dramatic difference. But even Brooklyn and Queens, there might be significant differences there. So do you have any thoughts on that layer of geography? Even, obviously state to state, there could be differences, but even beyond a more granular level, communities to community or neighborhood to neighborhood, how that might impact reentry and challenges on reentry.
Yeah, I think, there are, as I said, there are big differences in job opportunities from place to place. There are big differences in the way policing is done from place to place. We don't have to talk about policing in the context of reentry, but people who are coming home from prison are heavily policed and often returning to heavily policed neighborhoods. And then, another big difference is sort of rural urban differences in, especially if we're starting to look at things like transportation, access to services. The transportation also obviously relates to job access as well. The intensity of supervision is different in different places depending on what caseloads are. So I agree that there's huge variation and different challenges in different kinds of places.
I'm going to ask you a question, Dr. Harding, that I just received, but I think that it fits with what we're talking about right now, and it's about housing. And so how housing can be such an overlooked issue for young adults. And couch surfing is something that is very prevalent. And essentially we're dealing with sort of this lack of residential stability. So do you have any thoughts on the impact of housing, or maybe lack thereof of housing, for emerging adults who are on parole? And also if you're familiar with, and if you could highlight any differences for how housing impacts young adults in particular versus maybe older populations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree that, housing is foundational. If someone comes out of prison and they don't have stable housing, it's almost impossible to address the other things that they need to do in their lives: employment, getting back to school, building relationships. And the degree of housing instability we saw in our data is really just shocking. And we could not find any other vulnerable population that had this degree of housing instability. The median person is moving every 4 months. That means half of people are moving more frequently than that on average. Some of this is moves that are in and out of treatment programs, in and out of supportive housing programs, in and out of jail, and so on. So some of this housing instability is actually created by the systems itself. But when people can't don't have that foundation of stable housing, they can't. It's very hard to rebuild the rest of your life. I think on the question of how specific is this to emerging adults, it's actually the case that emerging adults are more likely to be housed with their family, which I guess if you think about it is not particularly surprising. But otherwise, they're also experiencing, because they're a little bit sort of less mature and more unstable, a lot of this housing instability that comes from kind of shuffling between institutions and things like that. I think if we could provide people with not just 2 weeks of housing or 1 month of housing, but 3 months, 6 months, 9 months of stable housing, I think that would make a huge difference. Easier said than done, obviously, but.
Yeah, I remember you had a line from the After Prison book about how sort of short the youth period sometimes seems to be, and how quickly the emerging adults are expected to find housing. And I think that sort of speaks to that, which is a few months doesn't, when we talk about it in this context, it doesn't seem like that long, but it's not something that I don't think is very prevalent, actually in practice. So Dr. Harding, you've touched on multiple points about reentry from a systems perspective. Just to name a few of these, sort of the shift in focus for parole on moving more towards monitoring and compliance as opposed to rehabilitation, as opposed to parole as a broker of social services, criminal records and the effect that has on employment and the stigma that arises from that, the increase in recidivism from misdemeanor prosecution. That's just to name a few. I'm going to ask you sort of what I call the druthers question. So if you had your druthers, it could be out of that list or it could be anything that you can think of. If there's any one thing that you could change about reentry from a systems perspective that you think would make the most difference in setting up young adults for success, what do you think that would be?
Yeah, and I think going back to our last questions, I think helping with supportive housing is definitely on that list.
Mm-hmm.
From more of a sort of traps perspective, I think developing alternative responses to violations, to giving our parole agents and probation agents a bigger toolkit of ways in which they can legitimately react when someone is struggling or starting to get into trouble. And that really takes into account what their needs are. So it's not sort of disruptive of their housing and their relationships and whatever employment that they have. So that I would say that. And I think also, I think doing that would help people to have better relationships with their parole or probation officers or agents. I think we've also in our research done a lot of interviews with people who are coming out of prison, and though there are exceptions and people who are sort of doing this work mean well and are motivated by important things, those relationships were often very difficult, and led people to make some poor decisions, right? So just to make it concrete, like I missed some parole appointments, and what do? If I don't have a relationship with my parole officer, I'm more likely to abscond, and then I'm really in trouble, right? If I have a relationship with that person and I feel like that person is going to treat me fairly and treat me as a whole person and help me address my needs, I'm more likely to go back and say, hey, I messed up. I know that. What can we do to prevent this from happening in the future? And I think honestly, that would make the work of being a parole or probation officer, much more rewarding work if those relationships could be stronger.
Mm-hmm. And so, to follow up on that, in your study of the criminal justice system, the study you did in Michigan and with young adults, would you say that the changing role in parole in jurisdictions where maybe you've seen that, is that possibly the most transformative reform over the past, let's say, 10 years that you've seen? Or would you say maybe there's something else that would take that title?
Yeah, I think that is really important. I would put a call out there for if folks are out there in the audience who are in jurisdictions or in agencies that are making those changes, I'd love to hear about it and potentially create research partnerships around that. Because I think having those examples of how that was done successfully is going to be important in sort of propagating the types of changes that we're talking about. So that's definitely one thing. There are other important things that are going on as well. We're focusing here on reentry, but in a sense, within the larger criminal justice system, this is sort of the smallest group, right? If we were to shift our focus to sort of earlier entry and contact points, which are much more common, right, to policing and courts, and make changes there, I think that will also hopefully sort of impact many more people, improve the lives of many more people, and also trickle through to the reentry population, who are a subset of that group. So, for example, reducing the amount of pretrial detention, eliminating cash bail, and things like that. On the very front end of the system, I think is also a place where there could be huge impacts.
So you mentioned our audience, and you mentioned having them sort of bring forth some of the reforms that maybe they've seen or they've heard about or implemented in their own jurisdictions. So given the variety of roles that we have among our audience members here, is there anything, any particular gaps in reentry that you think there is sort of ripe for being addressed by maybe a researcher practitioner partnership?
Yeah, I think I will say that what I've been talking about is very abstract. So I can't imagine somebody like listening to this and knowing exactly what to do, because I'm not going to claim I know exactly what should be done to implement these things. I think that's an important space in which researchers and practitioners can come together, start looking at what's happening in their local jurisdiction, in their local agency, with the young people in their community, and figuring out, okay, where in our systems can we intervene? And so I think that's really ripe for a research practitioner partnership, and also local collaborations with youth advocates and social service providers, not just the justice agencies themselves, because they can't be expected to do this by themselves, right? They need the support of the community that's around them as well.
So do you think that is the do you think that is sort of the best way for practitioners to start looking at this area, is to engage in that collaboration, start looking at that? Is there anything you can suggest, any resources or any strategies that you've seen to sort of best equip practitioners to minimize the traps and the harms that have been created by the criminal justice system?
Yeah, I wouldn't be claim to be an expert on researcher practitioner partnerships as a sort of methodology, but I think if I were engaging in one, I think one thing that's really critical is, of course, that those partnerships have to be based on trust and common goals from the very beginning, and that takes time and openness to to hearing other people's opinions and experiences and learning from each other. I think the first thing I would do, I guess, is to really take stock in a local place of what is really happening. Make sure everybody's on the page about what is really happening. How often do we use particular sanctions? What are the things that lead to those particular sanctions? Under what circumstances are they used? What are our other options? What are the outcomes that are actually happening? We can talk about research in other jurisdictions or nationally about what the pros and cons of these things are, but starting to understand locally what's happening and why, and then from that, then you're in a much better position to start thinking about alternatives and what resources the community has to provide agents with alternatives to revocation or other sorts of sanctions.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I'll ask you, Dr. Harding, I'll let you put your researcher hat back on for a moment, and I'll ask you again about your study. You examined a number of crucial outcomes. Are there any other outcomes that maybe researchers should be considering when we're looking at reentry for young adults after incarceration when they're returning home?
Yeah, there were some things that, especially because we're working with administrative data, we just weren't able to study. So our measures of health were very crude. We matched to death records, and we could see what death rates were and what the causes of death were. But there's a whole area of both physical and mental health, not just addiction, but of course addiction is part of that. That's right for study, but also stress and coping strategies. There's also a whole domain within sort of social psychology that I think is also worth probing a lot more deeply. So thinking about, we weren't actually talking to many of these folks. So, how do they see themselves? What goals do they have? What do they see as their strengths? How can we help them to think through what they imagine their life being, and how to connect that to, greater competency, greater feelings of confidence, so that they don't go back to the things the coping mechanisms they were using before, which is what got them, into trouble. I think that's what we most often see in this space is everybody comes out of prison extremely optimistic about, what they're, and you almost have to be, right? But if you don't have the tools and resources to live that new life you want to lead, it's very easy to fall back on the coping strategies you used before, which are, by and large, not long-term effective strategies.
Right. We do have a question, Dr. Harding, about your study. I know that the Michigan study was focused on young men in particular. Do you have any thoughts about any insights into the differences in gender, the impact of gender when we're talking about reentry for young adults?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to speak too much on this because we only had young men in this data set. There were just too few women, and we thought the experiences of women would be so different. We didn't want to just sort of lump them in with the men. There's a great book by sociologists at UMass Boston, Andrea Leverance, called The Ex-Prisoner's Dilemma, which is all about women's reentry. I would recommend that to people who are interested, or maybe you can have her on a future webinar to talk about that work. I think there are some differences. Men and women, especially with traditional gender roles, have different roles for themselves and their communities and their families when they come out. So women are much more expected to quickly take on caretaking roles, and whereas men are expected to have breadwinner roles, and those both of those roles are challenging when you're first coming out of prison and need to be taking care of yourself, for example. That's just one example. There are lots of other differences.
Yeah, and I think that what we were talking earlier about the impact of race, the impact of geography. I think gender is definitely one of those external factors that has a major impact, changes those trajectories in ways exactly like you were just talking about. So one thing I wanted to ask you, Dr. Harding, is I'm gonna quote you for a second. It's a good quote. I enjoyed it. So you had written that the moment of release from prison is a particularly opportune time to intervene in the lives of formerly incarcerated young men and in the lives of disconnected young adults more generally. Also related to the study, you've talked about how the transition to adulthood is something that develops over time. It changes past, those life events are met, they're failed to be met, and it evolves over long periods. So with that said, have you found, and possibly it is moment of release, but have you found that there were any particular changes or reforms, that there's any particular point at which that is most impactful for decreasing challenges to reentry and the power of system traps?
Yeah, I mean, I think you pointed to it, which is that initial time after release is really central for setting up the future trajectory. We know from research that the rates of re-imprisonment are very high in the first weeks and months after release. The risks of overdose death, of violent death, are much higher during that time period. So it is a sort of a time period of risk, but it's also a time period of opportunity, because people are coming out feeling optimistic, usually, are interested in reconnecting with their families. They're interested, in employment and accessing programs. And there's this sort of funny thing about prison when you talk to people who have been through it. They, of course, don't enjoy the experience and wish they hadn't been incarcerated, but they also talk about it as a turning point, like a moment in which they had the opportunity kind of to reflect about their lives and really sort of slow down and think. And so I think that's why that immediate period after release is just so important to get people supported and on the right trajectory. Back to that housing question, employment, and so on. Now, that said, I want to say that, like, just because prison has that positive aspect to it, that doesn't mean like that's the only way we do it. If we think about kids growing up in middle-class families, college is that opportunity for them. And this is a population that typically didn't have that opportunity to go to college. And so there's lots of ways we can provide young people with that formative time of introspection and planning and so on, other than prison. But it is one thing that people talk about prison doing for them.
Well, Dr. Harding, I think that I did not plan it that way, but I think that ended up being a very nice final thought for us. So that'll be the last question. But with that said, do you have any final wrap up or words of wisdom to leave us with?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll say, you know, in our discussion, we haven't really discussed the fact that what we've been talking about is a big change in the way the criminal justice system operates. It's a big culture change that we're asking people to make. It's a big change in the way resources are used. And so I think as we continue to do this work, and the practitioners out there and the policymakers out there continue to do this work, just sort of recognizing that this isn't going to be easy to do. We've had 40, 50 years of mass incarceration now, mass supervision, more and more punitive criminal justice system. We're starting to turn the tide, but it's not going to be an easy fight, but it's an important one.
Wow, David, Tom, I wish we had another hour to continue to listen to this stimulating conversation. So thank you. Big thanks from us at the YJI and from our audience for this thought-provoking conversation. I'm sure we are all going to continue to think about the insights that you shared with us today. So thank you. I'm going to turn to our audience now and ask you a quick question. Tell us how you felt about today's webinar. You should see on your screen right now a poll question asking how much you agree or disagree with the statement. The webinar was informative. I'm sure it was much more than that, but please chime in and answer to this question to the best of your ability so that we know how the webinar went for you. Heads up. Right after the session, you'll be getting an email from us with a survey that's a little bit more in-depth and that seeks further feedback. The responses that you give us help us improve these webinar series, and importantly, they also help us fulfill critical reporting obligations that we have to our funders. So I personally appreciate your 5-minute investment in this task. Thank you. Our next Lunch and Learn will be held on May 30th with Blaine Skiles. He is the Communications Director for the Decent Criminal Justice Reform Center at SMU's Dedman School of Law, which is in Dallas, Texas. Mr. Skiles' presentation is titled Research for Reform, How to Craft Reports That Make an Impact. So I think it will have very pragmatic advice for all of us in the world that we inhabit professionally. I hope very much to see you then, and I hope to see you at all of the other YJI events that we have. A final note, the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. I thank you again, and I hope to see you soon.